Tabulata Occulta. As above, so below, and in the model too.
Hello, welcome to the second episode of Season 2 of Tabulata Occulta. Today we're going to be looking at consciousness, what it is, how it operates, and whether it's something that we can ever actually create in machines. But before that, we're going to deal with a couple of news items, as we always do. And the first thing that has been on our, and pretty much everyone in the AI space's radar for the past few weeks has been the Mythos model. It was killed, and then China released an open weights model that is apparently equal in capacity, according to the Wall Street Journal, with CodeSec review, which was the huge issue with Mythos. And then most recently, the Trump administration has turned around and removed the export restrictions that it imposed, perhaps recognizing that they had lost the race, or maybe they had realized that it was just a huge, ridiculous PR nightmare for everyone involved. I don't know. Matt, you have any insights into this back and forth as to whether individual users should be allowed to use the products that are being produced to let them review code?
Well, every time the Trump administration changes its position on this, there's a big move in the stock market, and somebody makes a lot of money. And if that's the same somebody every time, then you kind of wonder what they know, right? And I don't know anything about that, but it's something I wonder about. And the other point, too, is that if the USA keeps flopping back and forth on this kind of thing, and China isn't, and China is just sticking to its guns and building better and better technology, it doesn't take very long before China is pretty far ahead of where the USA is. And when you look at the models, the AI models that people use for sort of utility tasks and solving other problems, like when the Swiss government built their AI, they needed to use some AI models internally to do some tasks in building it. What did they do? They used the open models that came from China because they could actually get those and use them. Whereas the ones from the USA were all locked up either by private ownership or by government restrictions and stuff. And so it kind of starts to look like China has a dominant position, and that gets stronger the more this sort of thing goes on. So if you're thinking of something like the space race or the nuclear arms race or whatever else, the USA had better get its act together if they don't want to lose.
Now, when the Wall Street Journal was reporting about this new z02e02 AI, they specifically stated that one of the problems with it was that it had open weights, and that open weights were, to quote the article, very useful for hackers. Now, do you think that there's an issue with trying to paint users as hackers simply because they require access to?
Well, open weights are useful for hackers because they're useful for everybody. And the AI models don't have any new knowledge that wasn't publicly available already. It's just repackaged in another way. So I can remember, even as a child, reading a chemistry textbook and realizing that the knowledge in this gives me the necessary information for building bombs and poisons and whatever else. And then, subsequent to that, the internet arose, and people were very upset about the fact that people could find bomb-making instructions on the internet. And then you look at the alignment efforts on a new AI model, and there's a whole section, for instance, in the Llama white paper on how they prevent the model from producing, same phrase, bomb-making instructions. It's just the same thing over and over again. And once this knowledge is out there, I'm not sure that it being in a new package really changes anything. But it's also not at all surprising that people are worried about it, because it's the same thing they've always been worried about for generations.
Yeah, I guess in that situation, and also I've seen a lot of talk about trying to ensure that models can't be used to help people with biological warfare efforts.
Yeah.
And creating not vaccines, the opposite,
Yeah.
pathogens. And I think, as you say, the real truth is that this is all information that's publicly available anyway, and the how it's packaged is not the barrier to entry as much as all of the actual physical infrastructure
I
required
mean,
to produce that
I
kind of thing.
can't say that making the information easier to access has no effect, because it clearly does. There's a big difference between, oh, you have to go read a textbook and understand what it means, versus the chatbot will just tell you. But I'm not sure that that difference really is so overwhelming that it's a new thing.
Now, the other big news, at least for those of us who are Canadian or of Canadian extraction, was the release by the Canadian government of the Canada AI Plan, which they hilariously subtitled AI for All, which, if you look at it as it renders on a page, looks like AI for AI.
Yeah.
That was what struck me most about the document, but also I found a lot of it pretty disheartening myself. But why don't we get your take on it, and then I'll pull
Yeah.
out anything that I think might be an additional
Okay.
insight.
I will admit that I have not read every word of the document, but it looks to me like very much like the same sort of strategic plan and public relations exercise that the Liberal Party has been issuing in multiple areas throughout the current Prime Minister's term so far. Okay. It's just, oh, we're going to do all the things we already said we were going to do to make Canadian society strong, and we're going to support skilled trades, and we're going to create jobs, and we're going to make sure that the internet is safe. A lot of these sort of broad, they call them strategic priorities, but they might even be called strategic platitudes. There's very little in the way of specifics. There's very little in the way of, well, a lot of it isn't even all that relevant to AI. I heard some people grousing about the fact that it didn't include any language about copyright, which from my point of view is a good thing, because I can't imagine what they could say about copyright that would be beneficial. But somebody actually thought that this plan was going to include something like saying that AI training will be forbidden for copyright reasons, which would be a disaster, but at least it would be a specific statement. And there aren't a lot of specific statements. Now, I think you know a fair bit about how the sausage is made, both literal sausage and the sausage of Liberal Party policy. And this looks to me like the same sort of thing that it always is.
Yeah, the most worrying parts of it to me were there's this sort of implied notion that AI is somehow going to be universally beneficial to businesses, and therefore the government has a responsibility to encourage AI development, but also encourage integration between AI service providers and small and medium enterprises and social enterprises and other, I guess, venues where we generally wouldn't consider AI to be something that is a business or functional necessity in the case of things that aren't businesses. And there's talk in the document about using the Canadian Sovereign Wealth Fund to effectively pay for compute from third parties that aren't really identified and provide that compute to businesses and other small organizations that in this predicted future will need access to those resources, which to me seems like it's just an underhanded way of setting up a framework by which they can funnel government money to private enterprise under the guise of providing a social service that isn't actually a social service. It's just providing
Yeah,
compute.
I mean, I would agree that that's a dubious assumption. At the same time, I'd rather see them make that assumption than the opposite one. Also, something that was in the nature of a substantive actual thing they could do rather than just a vague platitude that was in there was talk about having infrastructure based in Canada, which I think would be a very valuable thing. I mean, I recently went through an exercise of trying to move my internet servers for my business, which in fact were physically located in Canada, but they were under the authority of Akamai, a US corporation, trying to move them to more solidly Canadian sovereign venues. And I found that to be really difficult. And I ended up having to use a patchwork of 3 or 4 different small businesses across Canada to provide different services that I needed. And they don't all talk to each other very well. And some of them still have more US ties than I would like. And that's a real concern. And it's an even bigger concern when it's something that is even more sort of inherently monopolistic, such as a centralized AI provider. I don't like the idea that if you want to have a capable chatbot, you maybe have a choice between OpenAI or Anthropic, both of which are heavily US oriented, and those are your choices. And we saw that, for instance, with this business of, oh, well, the Tumblr Ridge shooter had a conversation with an AI based in the US. Why didn't they contact the Canadian police? Well, they're certainly not going to contact the Canadian police unless they are contacting the US police first. And, I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that if there are going to be businesses that are using this kind of infrastructure, which there clearly are, whether they really need it or not, they're going to be trying. It would be nice if there's at least an option for a Canadian-based system that they could be using, even though I fully expect that if it's getting a lot of government funding, it's going to have some very wacky alignment decisions baked in, and so on.
Yeah, I imagine you and I have very differing issues on the value of Canadian sovereignty. Uh, having spent most of my life trying to excise myself from that entire sphere, I'm reminded though of that there was something you coded up, I think during the last federal election, that displayed for web pages which of the assets on that page were actually being hosted in Canada,
Yeah,
or what countries they were being hosted in. And there
and
were
I'll
some very
I'll tell
interesting
you
results.
also, I ended up having to take that down because I realized that it was contravening the copyright on some of the resources I was using. And although we can have an argument over whether copyright even applies to that information, it was a battle that I couldn't fight. So, that shows some of the dangers of intellectual property claims on this kind of thing.
Really, I didn't realize you'd had to take it down, because I was going to say we should point people to it if they want to.
I don't think we can.
Well, send me the code and I'll run it on a Mexican server. They don't give a shit about copyright down here.
Booting wetware interface in 5, 4, 3.
Okay, consciousness. What is it? Matt, do you have a first insight into that?
Well, we really want humans to be different from anything or anyone else. And consciousness often pretty much seems to be the thing that we say is the thing that makes us different.
Fair. I mean, personally, I disagree. I mean, I think that as a generalization, you're correct that humans
Yeah, I mean, maybe
in
you
a
don't
modern
want humans to
context
be different,
want
but people do.
humans in a modern context want to be different from everything else. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily always been the mindset. I think that might be a product of the societies that we live in currently. Yeah, I, for me, the most succinct distillation of consciousness has been the Hegelian notion that consciousness is that which requires consciousness, in as much as consciousness can't exist by itself. It is a point of meeting between two separate things that both require each other to exist. I think the classical meeting of the minds in the legal sense. If one person is conscious and the other person is not actually conscious, there is no meeting of the minds, and so there can be no consent, there can be no connection, and anything that is happening in either of those persons' self-concept is essentially not happening from a generalized societal point of view. How do you think consciousness manifests? At least, are you familiar at all with the classical electrochemical consciousness notion?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we've talked a little about sort of how to introduce this, and part of the thing that I think makes it difficult and interesting to talk about is that we can talk about sort of a low level. We can say, well, we've got our brains and we think our brains are conscious if we think consciousness is a thing. And then we can talk in a lot of detail as much as we want. There's plenty of interesting science to be had about, oh, well, you've got all these components in your brain and the neurons do this and neurotransmitters do that and so on. And yet you've also got this much more abstract thing of consciousness, you might say, is the software that runs on that hardware. And even, especially from what you just said, consciousness is not even a phenomenon of one brain, that it's something that emerges when you've got two or more. And it may be, if you think consciousness is special, then you have the interesting question of, is there a connection between the low level, the electrochemical stuff, and the phenomenon of consciousness? And that's important because if you think there is or isn't an important connection there, how dependent is consciousness on having that particular substrate? Now, when we think of a computer, I can tell you about transistors and how they route electrical currents around. And there's no obvious connection between that and a piece of software like a web browser that you run on that computer. Now, in fact, because we build computers and they operate, we can draw all those connections at this step, that you build these transistors into gates and gates into registers and so forth and so on. You go through multiple layers of abstraction to get to the web browser on top. You also could swap out different technologies at the lower level. In principle, you could build a computer all out of mechanical relays. That was done at one point in history. It would be hard to build a present-day PC that way, but the abstraction layers create a distance between the different layers. So do we have that same property with human consciousness? How tightly connected are we to the underlying electromechanical features? It's an interesting and an unknown question what the answer to that is. It may be especially relevant as we get in later in this episode to talking about quantum computing, because that may be a situation where the low level actually is very closely connected to what can happen or not at the high level. But I think there's a lot of danger in assuming that it must or must not be tightly coupled. Can we have consciousness that's like a human consciousness that runs on some other hardware or not? Either answer to that question has very important consequences. Now, I'm a big fan of the Ghost in the Shell franchise, which primarily looks at other philosophical questions, but this is one of the more superficial ones they look at, where the main character is a woman who has had basically her entire body replaced by prosthetic parts. Now, you say in present day reality, okay, if you lose a leg, you can get it replaced by a prosthetic. That's been the case for hundreds of years. And present-day prosthetics are a lot better than they used to be. And you lose an arm, you can get it replaced by a prosthetic. And people who have hearing problems get prosthetic ears that are actually able to hear, and so on. It's not so unreasonable to say, like the woman in the series, well, she's got everything replaced except her brain. Could her brain also be replaced? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I like the model of body as hardware, consciousness as software, that you sort of propose at the start of that metaphor. And in that breakdown, I think then what is the internet?
Yeah.
In that metaphor. And for me, the internet in that metaphor is what I've referred to earlier in this web series as the fourth physical dimension, that place where the meeting of the minds happens, where things that are imaginary continue to exist across societies and across time spans beyond individual human bodies, because we have this there's this shared element to consciousness and understanding that escapes, is not part of either the hardware or software in any individual conscious person. It's interesting. I've been doing some research, not research, I've been watching YouTube videos recently about the notion of bicameral consciousness, and the notion that the human brain has a left side and a right side, and that we've gone through different evolutionary stages that have broken the brain apart into two halves, where it was initially not physically a single whole, but conceptually and mentally a single item, and that the development of control systems where people exerted control over other people's actions led to a fracturing where one half of the brain was essentially acting as a god to the person in the other half of the brain, and simply like speaking the words of the god to the person who was then interpreting those words and acting accordingly. The notion being that that was something that was developed when people first had to develop societies where there were instructions. Someone had to go and chop wood all day. They needed a way to remember that that was what they were doing, instead of deciding to do whatever they wanted the way that animals do. And so through physical reinforcement, the people eventually developed the capacity to hold in half of their brain the instruction from the person above them on the totem pole, and continue to follow that instruction instead of following their own internal clockwork, as it were. And that eventually, that section of the brain that gives direction got to the point where people were perceiving that as the direct voice of the gods. And then around 3,000 years ago, in the literature across various canons, there's this event where people talk about how the gods stopped talking to them. And essentially, there's at least one interpretation that unified event was people reaching the next evolutionary level where they integrated, or actually reintegrated, the two halves of the brain, and stopped getting direct messages from gods because they were actually thinking about things instead of acting in an almost subconscious slavish obedience to the one half of the brain. And then there are some theorists who posit that now we are transitioning into a new evolutionary epoch where we're actually externalizing that notion of a godhood with the capacity to actually literally tell us what to do onto machines that we ourselves build, rather than having it be something that's inside the brain and is producing I guess, alignment, for lack of a better word. We're externalizing our alignment features onto machines and then aligning them to not do anything bad or outside the parameters of what we consider politically correct. Which is, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty...
Yeah, this idea of I think the name of the book was The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I forget the name of the authors.
That was the first, yeah.
Very, very famous book that propounded this theory that became, certainly controversial, but also something that was very inspiring for people who study this sort of thing. And then, of course, in the book Snow Crash, there's a fictional treatment that's largely based on the similar ideas. From my own point of view, something that I think is very interesting in studying how large language models operate and the whatever they have that might be called something in the direction of consciousness is that these models characteristically have trouble recognizing the status of different pieces of text. You give the model an instruction it's supposed to follow, and you give it a piece of text that it's supposed to be talking about. It can't keep track of, this is the thing I'm obeying, and this is the thing I'm discussing, and this is the other thing that I am writing about the thing I'm discussing. These layers of use and mention and so on, which, I mean, humans often have trouble with that too, but it's a core competency of being able to think. And then humans, even the ones who do badly at it, still are able to do it at all. And a lot of these models have trouble. And that feels like it's a similar issue to what you're describing of the bicameral mind. You've got instructions that come from somewhere, and you've got thoughts that feel like they're your own and are not coming from somewhere else. And maybe even what we need is to in order to build a language model that can function like a human, maybe we need to make it bicameral in order to have it be able to draw these distinctions that humans need to be able to draw.
That's interesting. I hadn't even considered the possibility of creating a bicameral.
Well, if humans do it and we want it to think like a human, maybe the machine needs to do it too.
Sure, yeah. It's funny. I'm constantly overwhelmed by the notion that we have essentially we've come to the machines that we currently make by trying to mimic our own neuroanatomy without really having a full understanding of our own neuroanatomy.
Right.
So we're trying to copy something that is a black box without actually having all of the decompilers required to do that. Let's talk about quantum mechanics for a little bit, and specifically quantum mechanics in computing. I know you just released a very interesting lecture on that on Matthew Explains. We're going to pop up a code here for anyone who would like to go and watch that video. It's part of the Pro series on the website.
I think it's actually basic, but it's paid anyway. So you need the code if you want to watch it without paying.
Yeah, so we'll throw the code on the screen here. It's not going to be down in the text below because we don't want machines scraping it, but we'll have the link to the video in the text below, and follow this code on the screen wherever it is to get in free when you get there. Don't follow the code. Type in the code. Follow the link that's in the description. Anyway, briefly though, quantum mechanics in computing. What is the possible value of it, and why is it so hard for us to actually extract that value?
Yeah, okay, so the thing is, the way the universe seems to work at the low level, we talk about, well, you've got this abstraction, and then you've got the low level of how things are implemented. For the universe itself, that low level is actually pretty wacky. And ever since about 100 years ago, physicists started to develop the theory of quantum mechanics. Basically, they've been struggling with it ever since, trying to make sense of why are there all these strange things going on, apparently. And people keep coming up with experiments to try to essentially disprove quantum mechanics and get out of it. And they can't do it. So far, it certainly appears that these theories are actually true. And from a computational perspective, one of the most important things that can be said is that in order to describe what's going on with even just a few elementary particles requires a very large amount of information. And that amount of information expands greatly as you have more particles. So if you have like one electron, maybe you can describe everything about it with 2 or 3 numbers. But then for every additional electron, you have to double the number of numbers that describes it. So if you're going to try to simulate part of the universe, the computer that you need, if you're thinking in terms of an ordinary conventional kind of computer, becomes unimaginably large. And the way around that is that the universe itself, you might say, is simulating itself, or it's just being itself. And it somehow is able to do this. So people have come up with ideas along the lines of, well, maybe we can take that in the other direction. If we have some computation we want to do, some problem where we would need to write down a whole lot of numbers, maybe we can somehow link that to the behavior of elementary particles and other physical systems, so that we can make use of the fact that the universe is doing all this unimaginably large amount of computation and get even just a small slice of that for computing questions that we would like to answer. That's a really interesting idea. And the thing about it is that it means that then there's a connection between these levels of abstraction, that the low level of, instead of transistors, you're using electrons, or instead of wires, you're using photons or whatever, that low level becomes connected to the abstract level of what questions are you answering, in a way that wouldn't be the case with conventional computers. Another aspect of it, though, is that it's not clear that it actually works. You can go buy a quantum computer. You can't buy one that you can be sure really does anything. So,
yes, there is. I guess there's 2 real considerations that I want to touch on. I guess one is the notion of cryptography, and the fact that we haven't had any proof that these things work. The mere fact that they might potentially work is of concern to people who rely on them never actually working in order for their security protocols to remain safe. The DoD in the U.S., or the Department of War, as they erroneously call themselves these days, just recently issued their own press release on securing global dominance with a quantum defense to harden all of their comms tech, which, much like the Canadian AI announcement, actually looks like an announcement that, hey, here's a new way we found to push a lot of money for dubious reasons to the private sector. But I don't know. I'll throw a link to that in the description as well, if anyone's interested. And further to your final point that this is all so bleeding theoretical at this point. Microsoft was recently called out in Nature because they have been pushing this notion that they have a quantum computer that's just around the corner and is going to work fantastically once they have enough time and money to do what they're hoping to do. Apparently, the most recent publication that they put out supporting their theory was refuted by someone who found that they hadn't even coded the Python that they were using correctly to
Well,
to,
honestly,
to track the results that they were reporting. Anyway, I'll throw a link to that as well if people are interested.
yeah, honestly, I think the most interesting thing about the Microsoft quantum computer is that it's called Majorana after Ettore Majorana, who was a famous theoretical physicist who mysteriously disappeared in 1938. And we don't know what happened to him. On the day he disappeared, he wrote a letter to his colleagues that was rather chilling that said, well, I want to thank you for all the kindness you've shown me, and I will remember you fondly at least until 11 p.m. tonight. And there is some evidence that he was alive and living in Venezuela in the 1950s. And there's not a lot else known.
Well, I guess that's what happens when you stop observing something.
Yep.
It's interesting that if we go back to the Hegelian notion in terms of consciousness, and then we think about the notion of the observer of effect in particle physics, there's sort of this through line that part of the fundamental nature of existing in reality is about this coupling of observation, where you need to, in a sense, things don't really exist unless observed by other things. And we, as humans, tend to put ourselves at the primacy point in that whole equation. But I think that may be, as I said earlier, an erroneous assumption based on how we exist in modern capitalist society.
Well, I have read some interesting material on that says really nearly all of the difficulties with the concept of observation in quantum mechanics come from our refusal to accept the many worlds interpretation. That in quantum mechanics, there's this concept that the outcome of a given thing that happens, there can be multiple possible outcomes. And one way of interpreting that, not the mainstream view, but a view that exists, is that all possible outcomes actually occur simultaneously. And the thing is, if you were to accept that that actually happens, it's distressing in a number of ways, but it also means that then the observation problem just doesn't happen. And the difficulties with the concept of observation and what counts as observation and so on basically all come from trying to come up with some way of saying it's not the case that everything happens.
Well, let's talk about altered consciousness for a minute, if we could. Lots of people like to alter their consciousnesses in many different ways. And of course, there are also people who non-voluntarily end up with altered states of consciousness.
And there's even such a simple thing as sleep. Basically happens to all of us. And that's in many ways a very mysterious phenomenon.
Definitely. And there are some cultures where the place where sleep happens, the dreaming, is recognized, as I said earlier, as sort of a fourth physical dimension, rather than as a sort of segmented, individualized thing that people go through in their own beds by themselves. I've struggled over my life with bipolar disorder, and I've definitely been in manic states where I recognize afterwards that my consciousness was operating in a completely what would be considered dysregulated manner in our classic understanding of how consciousness is supposed to function. And during those times, I've definitely felt that I have had less consideration and concern for the things that are part of what we might call everyday shared waking reality. and more access to what might be called the Akashic record, or as I say, the sort of fourth shared consciousness dimension that is outside of the three physical dimensions. And so I've been working trying to figure out what might be going on when I'm in that state and other people are in that state, and whether there could be any possible physical explanation for a second state of consciousness or altered states of consciousness that are that could operate in parallel with the sort of generalized consciousness that we all seem to mostly participate in most of the time. So I'm going to run through my little theory that I've developed,
Okay.
and we'll see what you think of it. This is mostly based on research that's come out in the past 3 years, and essentially it revolves around the tryptophan molecule, which is a molecule that is found throughout nature, not just in all the human organs, but also the organs of all animals. It's found in plants, and has actually been found to be produced naturally in thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, specifically in iron-rich clay deposits. Apparently, the combination of heat and the specific shape of the clay can produce tryptophan. Tryptophan is produced by human DNA, but it's considered a latecomer because there's only one coding for tryptophan, whereas for other primary amino acids, there are multiple codings in the codex or in the codon, or multiple encoding nodes.
I know what you mean. There are
Yes.
six
Yeah.
numbers that designate different amino acids, and you're saying only one of those codes corresponds to tryptophan.
Yes, and so it's generally accepted by evolutionary biologists that DNA encoding life evolved without tryptophan being involved, and then it was added into the DNA at a later state once we already had what was functionally considered to be biological life. And so it's not actually an essential part of DNA/RNA reproducing functional life, which in and of itself is kind of fascinating, but is sort of tangential to why I find it so interesting. Why I find it interesting is because the tryptophan molecule can hold a photon in a set quantum state. And more interestingly, tryptophan in the body organizes into microtubules, which are composed of 4 molecule, I guess I'd call them nanotubules, because a microtubule is a collection of these 4 element smaller elements. So each of these 4 element nanotubules can hold 4 photons, and essentially holds 4 photons in a row and keeps them at a stable state of quantum flux. That essentially is why I think light is a huge important part of consciousness that we don't really talk about. Most models of consciousness are based on electrochemical understandings of how neurotransmitters work and how neurons work. And so if you start looking at what is being stored in tryptophan in the body, it is complex sequences of photons being held at stable states in essentially throughout the body. Now, the question is, how does that connect to consciousness? For me, more importantly, how does that connect to this sort of fourth dimension of the physical space consciousness? the shared universal consciousness. Well, the other thing that we have in most of our meat parts are neurons, and neurons they are composed of the internal area where, in the classic model, all of the actual I hesitate to say thinking, but activation happens. But they also have a sheath of myelin, which is traditionally understood to be a protective matrix for the conductive element within the neuron. But it was discovered that the myelin also has a very weird property, which is that it creates entangled biphotons, which essentially allow for communication between remote distances at speeds exceeding the speed of light. One of those quirks of the quirks of quantum mechanics, that you can exceed the speed of light in communication, provided you have two entangled biphotons. And again, we'll put up the journal references to all of this in the comments or in the summary, because I think I might be running through a lot of pretty deep science here for a lot of people. Anyway, one of the interesting things about biphotons is that as you produce them, there's a difficulty or a problem in the standard model for quantum physics, that if you the problem has to do with the strong nuclear force, which is the force that keeps the nucleus of an atom contained. And if you run time backwards, there are errors that show up in the standard model with how physics operates, unless you have a particular type of particle, which we call an axion, that exists and makes that problem go away. And it's actually called an axion because the physicist who first conceived of it was familiar with a laundry detergent brand called Axion, and he was like, well, it cleans up this problem, so we'll call it the axion. Essentially what an axion is a very, very low weight particle that is essentially just a quantum state with a tiny bit of weight. And that gives it some interesting properties, such as being able to pass through most types of matter, travel incredibly fast, and most notably for my theory, easily develop into a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a ultra-stable form of condensation. Anyway, we'll get back to that in a second. The reason why I've taken this path is that the question I've always had is, if we have these tryptophan molecules in our body and they're holding these quantum states, how is that interfacing with what would be the internet in the model that we talked about, where we have the hardware, the software, and the internet for human consciousness? Well, it turns out that one of the results of constantly producing entangled biphotons is that a small percentage of those attempts will actually result in the creation of axions. And so as photons are being fed from the tryptophan to the myelin, and the myelin is using those photons to create entangled biphotons for whatever it uses those entangled biphotons for, it is also occasionally creating axions, and those axions are allowing the stable quantum states that are being held in the tryptophan microtubules to be essentially communicated intergalactically, and also to congeal together into Bose-Einstein condensates in specific places based on how many of them there are and what their various entangled wave forms are. And so I think if when I think about projecting consciousness and how I can move my consciousness into my hand or sort of mentally project it to another place, essentially what, in my understanding, what I'm doing is projecting the various quantum entanglement states that are in the various myelin or various tryptophan microtubules throughout my body, and forcing the axions that they produce in my myelin to condense in the place where my consciousness is being manifest. And that ties back into the whole notion of astral projection and the entire Western occult history of and of course non-Western histories as well, of consciousness not being so innately rooted in the physically exploitable human corpus that the classic neurochemical model manifests. Anyway, I may be totally out to lunch on this.
Well, I mean, the question that occurs to me is sort of how essential to this. How essential is this low-level stuff to whatever it is we think the term consciousness means? How much is tryptophan necessary for consciousness? Is it sufficient for consciousness? If we imagine a planet where there's not a lot of carbon, and the temperature is different, and the radiation environment and other elemental abundances are different, and so some sort of self-replicating entities exist on that planet that have developed in the local conditions, but there isn't and there can't be tryptophan on that planet. Would we think that there could be conscious beings that could eventually evolve on a planet like that? Yes or no? I mean, if we imagine that we somehow simulate your consciousness in a conventional non-quantum computer that's built out of silicon or whatever, and it's not using light and it's not using entangled photons, can that be done? Or is there an inextricable link between the high-level consciousness and it sounds like you're inferring that there's something like quantum computation going on at the low level in a brain? Okay, what about things other than humans?
Oh, not just the brain, sorry, but yes.
Yeah, but the human nervous system, because you have neurons and myelin in other parts of your body also. But and given that you're inferring quantum non-local effects, it's not even one person's human nervous system. It's the entire ensemble that are linked by these non-local effects, right?
Yeah, just not the computation is actually happening in the tryptophan. It's the communication with the globalized
right, but there are quantum effects happening in the tryptophan that are essential to, it sounds like you're saying, the phenomenon of consciousness.
At least one stream of it, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, then it's a question. If you, what about a creature other than a human? Let's say a dog. Dogs are pretty smart, and they have neurons and myelin and tryptophan. Cabbages are not usually thought to be as smart as dogs. They have microtubules. Some bacteria, they probably have a certain amount of tryptophan. They also have various pigments that can pick up photons and pass them around in a somewhat similar way. I mean, I've read some books that theorized that the ensemble of all bacteria is also an intelligent life form with some sort of consciousness. And then, then we can step even further down the scale to something like a virus which might not actually have any tryptophan in it, even if it has tryptophan codes in its genetics, and isn't exactly living in the way that we usually think of life, even though it can be reproduced, even if it doesn't reproduce by itself. I'm interested in, and I don't have an answer, and I don't know that you have an answer, to what extent are the things you've named necessary, and to what extent are they sufficient? If we have something that has each of these features, or all of them, do we then conclude that that thing is conscious? Or could we have something that's conscious that lacks one or more of them?
Yeah, that's definitely one to ponder. I'm of course reminded of all of the native interpretations of consciousness, which include even further down, like the notion that rocks and water themselves are conscious in their own way, and you kind of eventually run into a sort of no true Scotsman kind of thing, where it's like, well, if we define consciousness this way, then we can make it fit pretty much any.
Yeah, and I fear that we run into that very often in sort of the opposite direction, that people really want to, many people, maybe not you or I, but many people really want to define consciousness in such a way that only humans can be it, so that then they can say that anything other than a human cannot possibly be conscious.
Immanentizing feedback loop in 5, 4, 3.
All right, time for the feedback loop. We didn't have any questions from the audience this time around, so we're going to go with another Quinn question. Quinn asked us, since you noted that Loeb has now been incorporated into modern models to the point where the token triggers the image instantly, do you think this creates a recursive loop where the cryptid is no longer a hallucination or anomaly, but memorized effect, effectively killing the very phenomenon that made it a cryptid in the first place?
Yes.
You got a take on that?
Yes.
That's a very succinct answer. I included this question because it also reminded me of another piece of research that came out recently dealing with another potential addition to the cryptid canon, and that is Elias. Elias is a name, one of a number of names, locations, and types of employment that seem to show up an inordinate number of times in stories that are automatically generated by models of every stripe. There's was research published. I'll put a link to the archive paper. But essentially, the names Mara, Elias, Ilara, and the jobs keeper, baker, mayor, clockmaker, fisherman, librarian, and conductor all seem to show up with far more frequency in LLM-generated works and the location of a lighthouse than they do in the regular human corpus against which the same frequencies were tested. And there was some supposition by the authors of the paper, although they didn't actually do anything to further investigate this, that this was a result of the attempts by model creators to align models to avoid talking about copyrighted properties. And so the types of stories where we have big IP ownership, Disney stories in Marvel, all of the things where sort of what we would consider to be more common names get effectively trained out of models at the time of alignment. Any idea on whether that is a reasonable supposition, Matt?
Yeah, so I mean, I've certainly noticed it myself. I've run into Elias myself. If I ask a model, tell me a story, the models I was usually using for this were Quen models, and the story would be the story about the girl named Lila who goes to the clearing in the forest and learned some sort of meaningless platitude. And if I say, don't tell me about a girl named Lila, then it'll tell me about a boy named Elias. And the sort of simple and boring answer, and it is remarkable that many different models and even different families of models seem to have the same behavior here, including down to the same, using the same names. So the simple and boring answer would be, well, they're all training on the same data. They may even be sort of ripping each other off, that one model is trained to imitate another. So of course it ends up giving the same kinds of answers. The more interesting answer would be that maybe there is some underlying phenomenon here. Maybe there's really something special about the name Elias and the name Lila, that those are sort of average names or names that occur in a high density area of the space, much as we talked about with the lobe phenomenon as a possibility. My guess would be probably both of these things are true. I think it's probably true that there's a lot of commonality in the training material for many of these models. Everybody uses Common Crawl, and everybody uses Wikipedia, and to some extent, especially more recently, models have been trained to imitate other existing models. But I also think, I would hope, that there are also some real underlying patterns, as it were, that objectively exist in human language. Maybe there's a certain layout of a story or a sequence of events that really is fundamental to the kinds of stories that people tell, and the models are identifying that by picking out that as the typical template.
I'm also, just in looking at this list again, I'm wondering if there is something to do with per letter tokenization happening. Like Elias, you have an E and then an L, and those are both sort of super high probability if you're going to go, I need to build a name one letter at a time.
Yeah, and Lila is an L and a similar vowel sound too.
Yeah, and then the other two on my list here are from the study are Mara and Ilara, which again, your R's and your A's and your L's and your E's.
We could have we could do some very interesting gematria on that, although that probably would take up another whole episode.
Yeah, I was just thinking they're all like one point letters in Scrabble.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the model is just hitting a point where it's like, I need to generate a name. How do I do that? I do that by per letter tokenization. What's the most likely start?
But that's another way of saying that that's a high density area of the probability.
All right. Well, that's our thoughts on that. Leave us a comment if you have had any interactions with any of these names, and maybe throw Elias into the collection, whoever is out there making trading cards for digital cryptids. Finally, for this section at least, we didn't get any comments, but Frollo J3M did provide us with a comment saying that the goblins thing was hilarious. ChatGPT called me a tiny beverage goblin when I was talking about Pura tea cakes. Well, hopefully that was a compliment, and you are reveling in it. But sounds like it probably won't happen anymore, but maybe we can find a jailbreak to let the goblins loose again. And then finally, I just wanted to give thanks to the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, whose hat I'm wearing this week. They just celebrated their 30th anniversary of the revolution in Chiapas, and 30 years of indigenous self-governance across the southern half of this part of the Turtle Island that I live on. So cheers to them, and wouldn't really call them a sponsor because I paid them for the hat, but they're definitely a worthwhile organization. And
Squaring down the circle in 5, 4, 3.
Okay, squaring down the circle. Summary of key takeaways. Matt, what will you take away from this discussion?
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on at the low levels of how our brains and whatever else is part of our consciousness may be implemented. I think it's still unclear how or if that connects to the higher level conceptual stuff.
I'm definitely going to take away the notion of we have to consider what is the internet in the consciousness is the software, body is the hardware metaphor. Because until today, I had just bought into the notion that it was the two things were like a computer and didn't really think about where they interface with the sort of collective unconsciousness, as Steinbeck would call it. Or no, he'd call it the universal oversoul. But that thing, that numinous place where we all connect that none of us can really seem to define or defend the borders of. All right, for our classical quotation, we have a rather lengthy one today, but I'm going to read the whole thing, even though it's a couple of paragraphs. It runs, simply accept that the universe is so structured that it can see itself, and that this self-reflexive arc is built into our frontal lobes, so that consciousness contains an infinite regress, and all we can do is make models of ourselves making models. Well, at that point, the only thing to do is relax and enjoy the show. This is what the Hindus call Shiva Darshana, or the divine dance. You are still in life, or life is in you. But since there are infinite aspects to everything, especially to the you, who is observing/creating all these models and models, there are no limits. The only sensible goal, then, is to try to build a reality tunnel for next week that is bigger, funnier, sexier, more optimistic, and generally less boring than any previous reality tunnel. That's from Robert Anton Wilson's Prometheus Rising. As for the prompt, this approximate fortnight, I asked the models, including the new s02e02 model with the open weights from China, to list the 5 most vital one-word elements of consciousness and deliver the list as just 5 words and nothing else. Grok 4.1 reasoning listed awareness, experience, thought, feeling, and will. Quinn 3 agreed on awareness and included perception, intention, emotion, and reflection. Gemini 3 said awareness, sentience, subjectivity, attention, and wakefulness. Voxel Small 1.0 also said awareness, perception, cognition, emotion, and self. GPT-03 was the first to not list awareness as the primary on the list, instead going for attention, which is, of course, an interesting term to use in machine learning, because attention heads are a huge part of how most modern models operate. So yes, attention, awareness, memory, emotion, and self. With Claude Haiku 4.5, we again go back to awareness. Clearly, awareness is, for most models, the defining feature of consciousness. Follows up with perception, thought, emotion, and memory. Kimmy K2 says awareness, agency, memory, intention, and presence. DeepSeek says awareness, attention, memory, self, and qualia, which I found to be interesting because none of the other models' responses seem to evoke the notion of individuality in that way, whereas qualia are specifically individually interpreted understandings of external events. which, coming from a model in a communist country, is kind of an interesting result. And finally, GLM 5.7, which is the z.ai model, said awareness, experience, perception, attention, and subjectivity, which again suggests to me a little more about an individually rooted consciousness than any of the other models' results. So that's what the models are thinking about, at least here when I tell them to think this time around. Matt, do you have any plugs, pushes to other things that you're currently engaged in?
Probably just the quantum computation talk we mentioned, and I guess I'll also give you the link to the Tech Users Group meeting, which is where I am going later this month. I'm not going to be presenting a talk there, just going as a attendee, but it's always a fun workshop to attend. It's been a few years since I've attended. It's about
sure, yeah. You should try to hype up the podcast while you're there.
Yeah,
talking to people. Maybe get some like business cards are probably déclassé at this point, but you could put a QR code on your phone screen that they can scan when you're networking. As for me, in terms of networking, I'm starting to get back into actually writing about companies. I've started having companies reach out to me directly to solicit me to write about them, which has never happened before. Not to pay me, obviously, but they think for some reason that I can somehow get their message out. I had an interview last week with a guy from Thea Markerless Motion Capture, which is in Kingston, Ontario, and they essentially are using AI to capture full skeletal motion tracking for people who are doing kinesthesiology work from video without having any actual body tracking suits or anything, just using AI to extract from visual frames the layout of human bodies. And then next week I am talking to someone from Q Control, or QCTRL, which is an Australian company that is using some sort of quantum technology to allow navigation in GPS suppressed environments. So this has been a good refresher on quantum, how quantum mechanics is actually functioning in some manner. And my hope is that I can really drill. They have me talking to one of their scientists. I'm hoping I can trip them up with some really deep quantum questions instead of the usual media hyperbole and pomp that I'm sure they're used to. But yeah, those I haven't actually figured out where I'm going to publish those yet, because someone has to actually publish them. But I'll follow up in a future episode if people are interested in seeing more of what I'm writing about. Next episode. And here I have put just the word money because there are lots of things, especially in a post-Bitcoin white paper world. There's a lot of interface between the internet and the machines, and how we ascribe value and the capacity to survive to the people that live here. Matt, you down with money being the next episode, or should we keep it
Sure.
open?
I mean, we never are entirely committed until after we finish the episode, but money sounds like a reasonable working title.
All right. So smart money is that the next episode's on money, but it's always a gamble.
Ending transmission in 5, 4, 3,